At my dad's retirement dinner, he raised his glass and said, "Only the children who made me proud are truly mine." Everyone clapped and cheered. Then he looked at me and said, "You can leave." I stood up slowly. But then my husband stood too. What he did next left everyone shocked. The grand chandelier in the Harrison Estates ballroom sparkled above the long head table, casting golden light over a sea of tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. Claire Harrison adjusted the strap of her navy blue dress and glanced at her husband, Daniel, who offered her a reassuring nod. They stood at the entrance for a moment, soaking in the grandeur, the polished marble floors, the string quartet playing near the fireplace, and the endless stream of guests mingling with champagne flutes in hand. Her father had spared no expense for his retirement dinner. Tonight was about Richard Harrison, the federal judge who had ruled courtrooms with unwavering authority for nearly 4 decades. And here, in this fortress of polished stone and carefully curated prestige, everyone had come to honor the man of the hour. Senators, former clerks, colleagues from the Department of Justice, even a few reporters from legal journals, it was a sea of influence and reverence. Claire had known this night was coming, but no amount of preparation could still the twisting in her stomach. She felt like an imposter, draped in silk but wrapped in the invisible gauze of judgment. Daniel, ever composed, placed his hand gently on the small of her back and guided her toward the table. Matthew was already there, impeccably dressed, a smile frozen in place as he charmed a cluster of older men. Her older brother had always been the star, Harvard Law, youngest partner in one of the country's most powerful firms, often compared to Richard himself. On the other side sat Rachel, poised and dignified, sipping wine and nodding politely to the woman beside her. Dr. Rachel Harrison, renowned cardiothoracic surgeon, head of department at a major Boston hospital. Claire knew their achievements by heart, not because she admired them, but because she had spent her life hearing them compared to her own choices. When Claire and Daniel reached the table, Richard turned from a conversation and greeted them with a brief nod. No hug, no smile. Just a nod, like a manager acknowledging a late employee. Claire sat beside Rachel, who barely looked up. Daniel positioned himself beside Claire, directly across from Matthew. The seat at the center, the one reserved for Richard, remained empty for now, a silent throne awaiting its king. The dinner began with practiced elegance. Plates arrived like clockwork, seared scallops over truffle risotto, filet mignon with a balsamic glaze, and a delicate citrus tart for dessert. Waiters moved quietly, pouring wine into crystal glasses, clearing plates with invisible hands. Conversations buzzed all around, laughter, legal anecdotes, praise for Richard's rulings and legacy. Claire listened in silence, her fork tracing idle circles on her plate. Every few minutes, she caught someone's eyes flicking toward her, subtle, then away. A few she recognized from past events, others only knew her by reputation. The artist. The one who had traded law school for finger painting, as Richard had once joked to colleagues during a Christmas dinner, not knowing Claire had been standing behind the door. Or maybe he had known. Her work, though praised in small gallery circles and modestly successful in New York's underground scene, was a blemish to the Harrison name. No accolades, no medical or legal prestige. Just paint, sculpture, and installations that disturbed more than impressed. At least in her father's world. Daniel leaned closer. "You're doing fine," he murmured. His voice grounded her. She gave him a faint smile. "Fine feels a bit generous. Just breathe. He can't touch what you've built." Claire nodded, but her eyes drifted to the end of the table where her father finally appeared, taking his seat to a round of polite applause. He raised his hand in a mock salute and smiled, a politician's smile, practiced and empty. His silver hair was neatly combed, his tuxedo tailored to perfection, a gold cufflink gleaming with the initials RH. Richard Harrison, even in retirement, was every bit the judge, commanding, distant, untouchable. When he looked in Claire's direction, their eyes met briefly. No words passed. But something in his gaze unsettled her. It was colder than usual, calculated. Like he had already written the ending to tonight, and she simply had not been informed of her role. As the wine flowed and laughter grew louder, toasts began. Matthew stood and delivered a speech about discipline and legacy. Rachel followed with a tribute to their father's integrity and work ethic. Each word felt like a soft slap, carefully constructed to exclude. Claire clapped politely, sipping her wine to keep from trembling. When the time came for Richard to speak, the room hushed. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The hush grew deeper. He surveyed the room like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. Every eye was on him. Every guest leaned forward. Claire's stomach tightened. Richard began by thanking his colleagues, sharing a few modest anecdotes from early in his career, an impossible case, a pivotal ruling, a joke about courtroom coffee. The room chuckled. Then he turned toward his children. "I am grateful for many things in my life," he said. "But nothing more than the legacy I leave through my children." Claire's heart skipped. "Matthew, Rachel," he raised his glass. "You've honored the Harrison name with dignity and distinction. You've carried forward the values I hold dearest: discipline, excellence, and service." The applause was immediate. Then he turned his head, slowly, toward Claire. "And as for the rest," he said, his voice unchanged, calm and even, "only the children who have made me proud are truly mine." The room laughed again, unsure whether it was a joke. Claire didn't laugh. Her wine glass trembled in her hand. Then Richard looked directly at her. "You may leave." The room fell into a silence so sharp it felt like glass shattering. Claire didn't move at first. Her limbs had turned to stone. Rachel's eyes widened. Matthew's mouth opened slightly, as if to speak but unsure what to say. Claire rose slowly, knees unsteady beneath her. Her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. All eyes were on her. And then, beside her, Daniel stood too. What he did next would change everything. Daniel's chair scraped back in perfect synchrony with Claire's, echoing sharply through the hall now gripped by silence. His posture was straight, shoulders squared, his hand gently resting on Claire's lower back as if to guide her away. But instead of stepping forward with her, he pivoted on his heel, turning to face the very man who had just cut his wife from the family like a line in a courtroom ruling. The stunned guests sat frozen, their expressions caught between confusion and disbelief. Murmurs began to rise like steam from boiling water, whispers not yet words, just noise, restless and unsettled. Some looked to Richard for a signal, some to Matthew and Rachel, but none dared speak aloud the question that was now burning in every mind. Was that real? Claire, still in shock, looked at her husband, her fingers barely clutching the silk of her dress. Her throat tightened, and she couldn't find air, let alone words. But Daniel's eyes weren't on her. They were on Richard. The judge, still standing, lowered his glass slowly. His expression didn't change, no guilt, no triumph, just that cold, judicial neutrality that had been his trademark for decades. It was as if, to him, nothing unusual had happened. Just a necessary sentence passed. Daniel took one step forward, then another. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick white envelope, sealed with a single, crisp fold. He held it up, not dramatically, but deliberately. His voice, when it came, was calm, clear, and controlled. "Before we leave," he said, "I believe it's time everyone here learns the full story behind Judge Harrison's retirement." The silence cracked wide open. All around the room, heads turned. Some guests stiffened in their seats, others exchanged confused glances. Matthew, who had been frozen with his hand still on his wine glass, stood so quickly he knocked over a chair. "What the hell are you doing, Daniel?" he hissed, stepping around the table toward him. Daniel didn't flinch. He simply held the envelope out toward a small cluster of guests seated near the end of the table, 2 retired judges, a former federal prosecutor, and a woman Claire recognized as an editor for the National Jurist. "I think you'll find these documents illuminating," Daniel said, passing the envelope directly into the editor's hands. "They include sealed records, transcripts, and case notes, some of which should have been publicly disclosed years ago." But weren't. Matthew reached out, grabbing Daniel's arm. "Stop this now," he said, voice low but urgent. "Whatever you think you have, this isn't the time or place." Daniel shook him off. "That's exactly why it's the time." At the table, Rachel's wine glass tilted in her fingers. She placed it down slowly, staring at Daniel like she didn't recognize him. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Claire stood completely still. She felt like she was watching someone else's life, someone else's family implode in slow motion. Her pulse pounded in her ears. And yet, the moment was painfully clear. Daniel turned to the editor, who was already slipping the documents from the envelope. "You might want to start with the Langdon case," he said. The name dropped like a stone into the water. Richard's expression changed. Only slightly, but Claire saw it. A flicker of recognition, a tightening of the jaw, a slight narrowing of the eyes. He knew that name. And he knew what it meant. "Sit down," Richard said finally, his voice steady but edged with steel. "This is not your fight, Daniel." Daniel met his gaze. "It became my fight the moment you tried to erase my wife in front of 100 people." Gasps and murmurs spread rapidly. All pretense of decorum faded. People were leaning in now, some whispering fiercely, others pulling out their phones, uncertain whether to start filming or leave quietly. The tension had reached a boiling point. A man in a charcoal suit, someone Claire remembered from her father's old chambers, stood abruptly. "Richard, is this true? You never mentioned the Langdon case." Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his water glass, took a slow sip, then looked to Matthew. "We'll handle this later," he said calmly. "There's no need for drama." But Daniel wasn't finished. He looked directly at Matthew now. "The Langdon case. 2009. Family Court Appeal. Teresa Langdon, single mother, had her parental rights terminated after a series of biased rulings. The original custody decision was questionable, but the appeal, Richard's ruling, was catastrophic. He turned slightly, addressing the room. Evidence of the father's abuse was ignored. Expert testimonies dismissed. And the attorney representing the father was Matthew Harrison. A wave of reactions swept through the hall. Some stood. Others leaned across tables, voices rising. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Her eyes locked on her brother, who didn't deny it. He didn't even blink. He simply stood there, lips pressed into a thin line, watching the chaos unfold with a lawyer's detachment. "This is defamation," Matthew finally said, his voice cool. "And you'll be hearing from my legal team." Daniel stepped closer. "I'm counting on it." Claire felt her breath finally return, but it came with heat, a flush of something she hadn't expected to feel in this moment, vindication. She looked around the room and saw the cracks forming in the perfect porcelain mask her father had worn all her life. The man at the center of the table, once untouchable, was now surrounded not by reverence, but by suspicion. The editor stood, documents in hand, flipping through rapidly. "Where did you get these?" she asked Daniel. "From people who wanted justice," he replied. "People who were silenced. Ignored. Manipulated. For decades." Someone near the back of the room said, "Should we call someone? The press?" Rachel stood now, quietly. "Stop this. All of you." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Everyone turned. "We can't let this happen like this. Not here." Claire finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Why not? Isn't this where he chose to humiliate me? In front of everyone?" Rachel looked at her. For the first time in years, really looked at her. "You don't understand," she said. "This isn't about you." Claire's lips curved into a bitter smile. "That's always been the problem, hasn't it?" The room began to divide. Some gathered near Daniel, reading over the documents. Others hovered close to Richard, speaking in low tones, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. A waiter hesitated at the edge of the room, clutching a bottle of champagne, unsure whether to serve or flee. Daniel turned to Claire and extended his hand. She took it. And in that single moment, the fragile scaffolding of the Harrison legacy began to sway. But neither of them could have predicted what would come next. For a split second after Claire took Daniel's hand, it seemed as though the room had reached a standoff. Conversations froze, breaths were held, and all eyes bounced between the couple standing hand in hand and the documents now being passed from table to table. But Daniel wasn't done. Not even close. He gently released Claire's hand and stepped forward again, this time turning to the crowd with a voice firm enough to recommand the room. "There's more," he said, reaching back into his jacket. "The Langdon case is only the beginning." A low hum of anticipation rippled through the crowd. The initial shock had worn off, replaced now with a strange collective curiosity, a hunger to know what had been hidden beneath the carefully constructed image of Richard Harrison. It was the kind of moment that suspended time, too late to stop, too raw to ignore. Daniel withdrew a second envelope, larger, slightly worn. Claire recognized it immediately. It was the one he had kept in his locked desk drawer for years. She had seen him add to it quietly, methodically, but he had never explained what was inside. Until now. "This contains evidence collected over the last 6 years," he announced. "Not from a vendetta. Not for some political motive. But to finally bring to light the kind of justice Judge Harrison truly stood for." He handed the envelope to the same editor who now had a notepad out and was scribbling feverishly. She opened the flap without hesitation, revealing a thick stack of pages, typed statements, notarized affidavits, printed emails, and old court transcripts. Daniel looked around the room. "Many of you in this room worked with Judge Harrison. Some of you admired him. Some of you feared him. And some of you," he turned slightly, scanning the faces of a few stern men and women at the far end of the table, "protected him." Matthew started to move forward again, but Rachel placed a hand on his arm. This time, she didn't try to stop Daniel. She just watched. Daniel gestured toward one of the older men seated at the head table, retired Judge Gerald Whitmore. "Your Honor, you were on the appeals panel in the Carter case. You dissented. And yet the ruling stood, because Judge Harrison used his influence to sway the presiding opinion." Whitmore straightened in his chair, face darkening. "That case was settled nearly 20 years ago. But the child involved is still in therapy," Daniel replied evenly. "And her mother has been waiting 2 decades for someone to admit what really happened." Gasps rose again, quieter this time. Some guests turned away, embarrassed or ashamed, while others leaned in closer to hear more. Claire watched it unfold like a wave finally reaching the shore. For so many years, she had internalized her family's disdain as something she simply had to endure. The way they treated her career, her choices, her independence, like she was some stain on their perfect narrative. But Daniel's voice, calm and unwavering, was slowly tearing that narrative apart, piece by piece. Daniel continued. Judge Harrison's pattern was clear. Cases involving high-profile clients? He ruled in their favor. Custody disputes where one party had political or financial leverage? He tilted the scales. And when questions were raised, they disappeared. Sealed records. Missing testimonies. Suppressed expert opinions. A few people had now pulled out their phones, not to film, but to search. Claire noticed one guest scrolling through an online database, frowning as he compared case numbers. Another whispered into the ear of a woman beside him, who was already typing furiously. Daniel wasn't finished. He turned, slowly, and this time faced Richard directly. "You thought this dinner was your curtain call," he said. "But it's the start of an investigation. One that will no longer be shielded by your name, your position, or your legacy." Still, Richard said nothing. His expression was a mask of disdain. But Claire saw his hands. One had curled into a fist on the table. The knuckles were white. "I know what this looks like," Richard finally said, voice quiet but sharp. "You think you're the hero here. You think you're doing this for justice. But this, he waved a hand toward the documents, toward the guests, this is theater. Daniel took a step closer. No. This is consequence. Claire felt a chill pass through her. It wasn't from fear, it was something else. A strange sense of closure beginning to take shape. The editor flipped to the back of the envelope's contents, pulling out a typed sheet marked, Timeline of Incidents. She glanced at Daniel. Is it verified? Cross-checked with official court records, transcripts, and 3 whistleblower testimonies, he said. The names of the witnesses are in sealed attachments. They're willing to go public now. A man from a regional paper, who had been lurking near the bar, began recording discreetly. Matthew stepped forward again, voice strained. If any of this is true, why now? Why wait until tonight? Until a private event? Daniel didn't hesitate. Because this isn't a private man's retirement. This is a public figure who shaped the futures of thousands of families. And some of them were destroyed. Rachel looked down at the table, suddenly very still. It was a simple movement, but Claire caught it. A quiet crack in the foundation. Daniel turned back to Claire and reached for her hand again. She took it instinctively. His voice softened, only slightly. I promised you I'd support you. But I also promised myself something, that I wouldn't let this man rewrite your life story. Not without knowing the truth about his own. Claire's eyes burned. Not with sadness, but with something that felt dangerously close to gratitude. Or even love. She hadn't known the full scope of what Daniel had done, what he had been preparing all this time. But now, it all made sense, the nights he stayed up late reading court decisions, the unexplained meetings with journalists, the subtle way he'd urged her to revisit her own doubts about her father. One by one, guests began to rise. Not to toast. Not to applaud. But to leave. Some shook their heads. Others gave Claire and Daniel quiet nods of respect. A few paused near Richard, offering awkward farewells before disappearing into the hallway. The air was no longer heavy with celebration, it was electric with fallout. Richard remained seated, jaw tight, eyes forward. He didn't look at anyone, not even his children. Not even the guests now whispering as they left. And when the last chair scraped back from the table, and the final glass of untouched champagne sat sweating on the tablecloth, the great Richard Harrison was alone at his retirement dinner. The storm had only just begun. Claire and Daniel stood still in the center of the ballroom as more guests filtered out, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpeting and the sheer discomfort hanging thick in the air. The grand chandelier above them no longer felt like a symbol of celebration, it was a spotlight, exposing everything that had been hidden under decades of silence and reverence. At one end of the room, the string quartet had long stopped playing. Their instruments now rested silently on velvet stands, as forgotten as the ceremony they had come to support. Near the head table, the editor from the National Jurist, whose hands now held more weight than any toast spoken that evening, moved to a corner table, quickly laying out the documents Daniel had provided. 2 retired judges, a senior law professor, and an investigative journalist joined her. None of them spoke at first. The only sound was the turning of pages, the creak of chairs, and the occasional tap of a pen on the edge of the table. Claire moved closer, curiosity and dread wrestling within her. She stopped just behind Daniel, placing a hand gently on his back, not for support, but to feel that he was real. That this was real. He didn't turn to her, but she felt his muscles tense beneath his suit. He was preparing for something. She could feel it. Then came the voices. Low at first, short exchanges of disbelief and analysis, but they grew in intensity. One of the retired judges, an elderly man with a sharp nose and years of courtroom control in his tone, tapped a finger repeatedly on a court transcript. This is a direct contradiction to the public record, he said. It's not redacted. It's altered. The law professor nodded slowly. That's not just unethical. That's criminal. Who signed off on this? The editor didn't look up. According to this, it was Judge Harrison. Twice. The ripple of that word, twice, moved through the group. They knew what it meant. One incident might be dismissed as a clerical error or a lapse in judgment. Two suggested a pattern. And within the stack of documents were more than two. Claire stepped forward, unable to hold back. Which case is that from? The professor glanced up at her, hesitating for a moment. Then he handed her a page. Family Court. Evelyn Morris vs. State Custody Division. Mother was institutionalized based on expert testimony that was later retracted. But the judge ruled before the retraction was entered into record. That child ended up in 4 foster homes. Claire scanned the page, her vision blurring as she read. She remembered this name. Not from the news, but from one of her earliest sculpture sketches, a piece she never finished. A mother's silhouette carved in dark stone, arms outstretched, separated from the abstract form of a child floating just beyond reach. She had sculpted that story before she ever knew it was real. Daniel moved beside her. They buried that case. The editor didn't look up. Until now. In the background, a door opened. Matthew re-entered the room, flanked by 2 younger men in suits, associates from his firm, no doubt summoned in a flurry of calls outside. He walked straight toward the table, ignoring the guests still murmuring near the exits. "This ends now," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The law professor rose slowly. "Are you denying the authenticity of these documents?" "I'm saying this isn't the place to adjudicate them," Matthew replied sharply. "If any of this is legitimate, it should go through the proper legal channels, not through a public ambush at a private event." Claire narrowed her eyes. "You mean not in front of witnesses?" Matthew turned to her, jaw tightening. "You don't understand the damage this could cause. To reputations. To the judiciary. To victims," Claire cut in, stepping forward. "You mean the reputations of judges and attorneys who used their power to silence people like Teresa Langdon? Like Evelyn Morris? What about their damage, Matthew? What about the children?" He shook his head, visibly losing patience. "Claire, this isn't the time for emotion. That was a mistake." Claire stepped closer, her voice rising. "Emotion? You think this is about emotion? You stood by and watched our father destroy people's lives for decades because it helped your career. And now you want to control the fallout because you're worried it might stain your LinkedIn profile?" Gasps, quiet and scattered, echoed around them. Even Rachel flinched at the harshness of it. But she didn't interrupt. Daniel remained calm, his arms folded. "There's more," he said. "Much more." He turned to one of the guests who had remained, the investigative journalist who had silently recorded everything since the first envelope had been opened. Daniel handed him a USB drive. "Everything's on here. Source verification, supporting documents, audio interviews. We knew tonight might not be enough. So we prepared." Matthew's composure slipped for the first time. His hands clenched, and his voice cracked slightly. "This is character assassination." "No," Daniel said. "This is truth." The journalist looked at the USB, then at the editor. "Do we publish?" The editor took a breath. "Start with the Langdon case. Lead with the sealed records. Cross-check with the Morris files and the incident timeline. If it checks out, it's going to be everywhere by morning." Rachel finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the resignation in it. "It already is." Claire looked at her sister, stunned. "What do you mean?" Rachel lifted her phone, screen lit up with notifications. "Someone leaked a draft of the dossier. It's already hit a few blogs and forums. Hashtags are trending. Legal Twitter is already calling it the Harrison Files." Claire blinked, feeling the room tilt slightly. Not from dizziness, but from the sudden shift of power. For years, Richard had shaped reality with rulings and silence. Now, reality was shifting without him. In the corner, Richard still sat, unmoved. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were no longer scanning the room with control. They were watching a world collapse, brick by brick, document by document. The law professor turned back to the group. "I recommend we begin a formal review." "Immediately." The journalist nodded. "And I'll be reaching out to the victims mentioned in the files. They deserve a voice now." Claire turned back to Daniel. "How long have you been preparing this?" He looked at her, not with pride or triumph, but with something deeper. "Since the day I saw how much it hurt you to come back here. Since I realized silence wasn't neutral, it was complicity." She felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. For years, she had blamed herself for being the disappointment, the black sheep, the one who never measured up. But in this moment, she understood something she had never dared to believe before. She had never been the weak one. She had been the one who saw the truth first. And now, everyone else was finally catching up. The ballroom, once grand and bustling, now felt stripped bare. Most of the guests had gone. The few who remained sat in clusters around scattered tables, locked in intense discussion, scrolling their phones, comparing notes, and in some cases, simply staring ahead as if trying to process the unraveling of a legacy they had once revered. The weight of everything that had come to light hung in the air, thick and inescapable. Daniel had stepped aside with the journalist and editor, guiding them through the contents of the USB drive. They spoke in low voices, but Claire could catch words like timeline, testimonial, and external validation. A digital trail was forming, one that would be impossible to bury. Meanwhile, Claire sat alone at a corner table, her eyes on a folded document that had fallen loose from the second envelope. She hadn't noticed it before, not in the rush of the moment, not when everything else had been moving so fast. It wasn't typed. It wasn't an official transcript or report. It was handwritten. Her fingers hovered above it before she finally picked it up, unfolding it with delicate care. The paper was lined, the handwriting slanted and deliberate. No heading. No legal jargon. Just raw words, written in ink that had bled slightly at the edges. She began to read. "My name is Teresa Langdon. And before anyone dismisses me, I want you to know, I wasn't perfect. I was scared. I was a single mother with a toddler and no family. I worked 2 jobs, lived in a shared apartment, and I made mistakes, like every parent does. But I loved my son. More than anything." Claire stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. "I was brought to court after my ex, who had disappeared for over a year, resurfaced and filed for custody. I had documented every missed visit, every unpaid child support check, every threatening message. I came prepared. I had witnesses. I had evidence. I had hope." The next line was underlined twice. "But it didn't matter. Judge Richard Harrison didn't even look at my file." Claire felt a chill pass over her. Her eyes scanned ahead. "I was told later that the opposing counsel had lunch with the judge's son the week before the hearing. They were friends from law school. I don't know if that mattered. I just know that during the hearing, I was asked more questions about my tone than about my child's well-being." The handwriting grew shakier toward the end. "My son was taken from me. Placed with a man who hadn't seen him in over a year. I got 30 minutes a week, supervised, in a cold room that smelled like bleach. And when I cried, they wrote it down as emotional instability. I lost custody. I lost myself. And no one ever listened. Not until a stranger knocked on my door and asked if I remembered the name Daniel Harper." Claire's eyes filled with tears. She stood abruptly, the letter still in her hands, and turned to Daniel. He looked up at her immediately, concerned. She didn't speak. She just walked toward him, held out the paper, and waited. Daniel took it, read the first few lines, and nodded slowly. "That was the first one," he said. "The first voice." "You found her?" Claire asked, voice low. "She found me," he replied. "After one of your early exhibitions. You had a sculpture titled Silenced Mother. She said it looked like her. I didn't believe her at first. But then she showed me court papers. Old photos. I started digging. Claire sat down beside him. She said no one ever listened. They will now, Daniel said. The editor had been watching quietly. She leaned forward. Can we publish the letter? Claire hesitated. We should ask Teresa. We already have her consent, Daniel said. She signed a release. She said, use it if it helps someone else be heard. The journalist scribbled something down. Her story may be what breaks this wide open. People connect with people. And this isn't just about law, it's about lives. Claire looked around the room again. Matthew was gone. Rachel stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, staring into the empty air. Her face was unreadable. Richard hadn't moved. She rose again and walked toward him, the letter still in her hand. He didn't look at her. Not at first. But when she stopped in front of him, he finally lifted his eyes. This is from Teresa Langdon, she said, holding the paper gently. Do you remember her? He said nothing. She remembers you, Claire continued. She remembers how you looked at her like she was nothing. Like her pain was inconvenient. Like her love for her child was a nuisance. Still nothing. Claire sat down across from him. The same table where, hours earlier, she had barely been acknowledged. Now, she had his full attention, though his face remained impassive. Why did you do it? She asked. Why her? Why all of them? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his glass of water and took a slow sip. When he set it down, his voice was quiet and mechanical. You think the world is fair, Claire? You think truth wins on its own? Claire stared at him. I don't think truth wins. I think it fights. I think it bleeds. But it's the only thing that survives. Richard looked away again. You're not part of this family. I know, she replied. You made that very clear. There was no emotion in his face. But Claire no longer needed emotion. She didn't need approval. She didn't even need answers. What she needed, what she had been denied for years, was already taking shape around her. Justice wasn't a verdict. It was a reckoning. She stood, turned her back on him, and walked back to Daniel. We should find Teresa, she said. We should bring her here. Daniel nodded. She's already on her way. Claire blinked. What? She insisted, he said. When I told her the documents would be released tonight, she said she wanted to be here. To see it. To know it really happened. Outside, the sound of a car pulling up echoed faintly through the hall. Claire turned to the door. Justice had a face now. And she was about to walk through the front entrance. The grand doors at the back of the room swung open, and in walked Teresa Langdon. She paused in the frame, silhouetted by the entrance's warm light, a figure both fragile and undeniably strong. For a moment, she stood motionless, taking in the scene. Her son hung close at her side, clutching her hand. The boy must have been 8 or 9, thin, with wary eyes. The hush that fell was not from ceremony, but from the tremulous expectation that something real was about to unfold. Daniel saw her first. He reached out, guiding Claire gently by the elbow, directing her attention toward Teresa. Claire's heart hammered, throat tight. She stood as though they were meeting after years of absence, even though Teresa had only ever existed through paper, sculpture sketches, whispered rumors of the courtroom. Now she was here, alive, the author of the letter Claire had read just moments ago. Teresa drifted forward, her face soft, yet lined with years of grief and fight. Daniel moved toward her. Thank you for coming, he said, voice warm but not loud, enough for those nearby to hear. A few people at adjacent tables turned, curious. Unknown faces murmured, some reaching for their phones. The journalist snapped photos. The editor nodded approvingly. Teresa offered Claire a small, sad smile. I had to see it, she said in a voice that cracked and soothed in the same moment. The ballroom's remaining light hit the tears in her eyes. I wanted to know it wasn't a dream when my own words were held in someone else's hands, someone who believed them. Someone who listened. Claire swallowed. You were never alone, she said. Then louder, so others could hear, you called my name. Your name called mine. She glanced at her father. And now your story is here. Here in actual daylight. Richard's face remained impassive, but for the first time that night, Claire saw him shift in his chair, once, sharply, like a man realizing at long last that the ground beneath him was slipping. The gold cufflinks, the silver hair, the tall mantle of authority, all felt strangely inadequate in that moment. Teresa moved forward and placed her letter on the same table that bore the documents and USB drives. The law professor picked it up gently. A recording device was already out. Someone from the press, a retired judge perhaps, began reading a paragraph aloud, about the lunch with Matthew, about the ignored testimonies, about the emotional fragility labeled as instability. Every word hung heavy in the air. In the second row, a woman stood up. I knew someone like Teresa, she said. Her voice trembled. My name is Susan Quinn. My case was 9 years ago. I asked for mercy. I asked for fairness. I was told the judge would see it, but he never asked me a thing, just my whereabouts, my background. Not my heart. Another voice rose. Were you heard? Someone asked, low. No, Susan said, looking at Richard. I was invisible. That word resonated with Claire. Invisible. It encapsulated everything she'd ever felt under her father's eyes. Teresa's son tugged at her dress. She nodded to him. He stepped forward, oddly composed. He handed her a folded drawing, crayon lines, a rough figure of a mother and child, separated by jagged lines. Claire recognized it at once, something she'd encouraged young mothers in Teresa's support group to let their children draw, when nothing else seemed to reach them. The son offered the drawing to Richard. His voice quiet, he drew this because he doesn't know you except through stories. Because no one ever showed up for him when he was scared. He drew us apart. Silence. The careful breathing of shocked guests. A fork clinked somewhere. A chair gently scraped. Richard's hands tightened on his cane. He looked at the picture, then at Teresa, then at Claire. No tears came. Claire couldn't tell if he was going to speak. The moment stretched. Then Matthew moved, but not toward his father. He crossed to stand beside Teresa's son, touching his shoulder awkwardly. I am sorry, Matthew said. His tone was small, unaccustomed. The people near him looked over. Genuine apology was rarer than any spectacle that night. Rachel stood beside Matthew. She leaned in, placing a hand on her brother's back. She was pale, eyes glistening. This should have never happened, she said, so quietly that only those immediately nearby heard. Then turned her face away. Richard suddenly cleared his throat. It was a harsh sound, abrupt. Teresa Langdon, he said, voice steady. You have accused me of wrongdoing. I deny having intended harm. I acted on what I believed were the responsibilities of my office. Teresa raised her chin. Then start with this, she said, stepping forward, holding up a folder. These are new affidavits. 2 recent psychological evaluations affirm what I told you then. I trusted the legal process. You denied me hearing, but not for lack of pleading, not for lack of proof. The room was still. Few moved. The editor looked at the folder, then at Richard. Would you like to review them publicly? She asked. Richard closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, the silver inside his gaze looked colder, more brittle. I request proof, he said. Authentic documents. Official court records. A retired judge, nodding, raised his hand. These, we have cross-verified them. They match sealed records. They were overseen by independent counsel. He leaned forward. They provide exactly what Teresa has asked for, clarity. Richard's voice softened, thin but audible, I feel betrayed. Claire's chest tightened. Not from regret, but from watching truth rend the old loyalties. She stood again, placing a hand on Teresa's arm. No more betrayal, she said, looking her father dead in the eyes. We're done letting silence do your defending. Guests shifted, some rising, others stepping back. Phones were raised, photos taken, live feeds starting. Media lights flickered in the corners. Teresa nodded, satisfied not with vengeance, but with acknowledgement. Richard stood, slowly, as if every joint protested. He straightened his posture, clearing the space that years of authority allowed. But this time, his posture was exposed, vulnerable. He looked at Matthew and Rachel. Then at Claire. Then at Teresa and her son. Then at all the faces around him. I will provide access, he finally said, voice heavy. To all records this dinner has made public. To inquiries. To whatever needs to be seen. For a heartbeat, a hush. Then something like relief spread through the room. Perhaps not joy, too many wounds. But relief. Claire let Teresa's hand go, turned to Daniel, who had been watching, silent. She felt no triumph, only an exhausting kind of peace. She looked around, Rachel's eyes were wet. Matthew's jaw clenched, both in pain and release. Teresa's son handed Claire a small sketchbook he had been carrying. For you, he said. Claire accepted it, voice thick. Thank you. Outside, sirens wove through the neighborhood, news vans, the hum of cameras. The Harrison Mansion's windows glowed, broadcasted by spotlights as reporters converged. The retiring judge's dinner had become more than a farewell, it was a reckoning played out in public. In that moment, Claire understood that what had been hidden in darkness was always meant to see light. And with Teresa standing, with her son handing over truth and drawing, the Harrison legacy would never again be held sacred by fear alone. Justice was no longer just a word. It was arriving. The ballroom was no longer the site of Richard Harrison's farewell. It had become something else entirely, an unofficial tribunal, a truth-telling sanctuary, and a stage for reckoning. Yet amidst the tension and the careful unfolding of the past, something else had been waiting, quietly, deliberately. Claire stepped back from Teresa, her mind buzzing. Though the crowd had turned its focus to the documents, the testimonies, and the fresh confessions blooming from previously silent lips, Claire knew she had not yet spoken her truth. Not the full one. Not the one that had lived in her hands, in her brushes and stone tools, in the long hours in her studio when her family thought she was merely playing with shadows. She glanced at Daniel, who immediately read her intention. With a simple nod, he stepped toward the long wall beside the head table, where a wide projector screen had been folded behind a curtain since the beginning of the night, meant originally for a montage of Richard's legal career. That slideshow would never be played now. Daniel tapped the screen's release. A slow mechanical hum followed as it descended. Then, he pulled a tablet from his coat pocket, the same tablet Claire had seen him carry on every major trip for the last 2 years. But tonight, he wasn't just carrying her work. He was unveiling it. Claire took her place at the front of the room, near the screen, the tablet now in her hands. The room quieted again. Guests leaned forward, sensing another revelation. The journalists still present raised their cameras. Even Rachel, standing at the back, straightened. Claire's voice was soft, but steady. My father believed in evidence. In visible facts. In what could be proven on paper. But not every story leaves a paper trail. Some are buried in the walls of courthouses. In whispered conversations. In closed chambers. Or in forgotten people. She tapped the tablet. The screen came to life, revealing the first image, a dark sculpture, almost haunting in its simplicity. A woman with no face, arms bound, yet still standing. This was part of my most recent exhibition in New York, Claire continued. It's titled Unheard. Every piece was inspired by real court cases, cases decided by Judge Richard Harrison. Most were never questioned. Some were sealed. Others quietly vanished. But the people affected by them did not. Another image appeared. This time, a child's outline, too thin, hands raised against an invisible barrier. The title beneath read Minor 14b. That, Claire said, is based on a foster case where a girl was removed from her aunt, her only caregiver, and placed with strangers across the state line. No charges were ever filed against the aunt. No explanation ever given. She never saw the child again. The child was 5. Murmurs spread. Daniel stepped back, letting Claire command the room. A third image emerged. A sculpture of a courthouse, not upright, but cracked, fragmented into sections, as though shattered from within. Each broken slab had names etched into it. Claire had spent 3 years carving those names by hand. These are the victims of decisions no one questioned, Claire said. But they are not statistics. They are lives. Families. Children. Mothers. Fathers. People failed by power dressed as justice. Rachel stepped closer now, toward the front. She stared at the screen, transfixed. Her mouth parted slightly, a visible unease creeping into her expression. Claire turned toward the guests. You see, I wasn't just playing artist, as my father called it. I was documenting history. The kind no one wanted to look at. The kind that asked hard questions and made powerful people uncomfortable. The next image hit harder. It was a bust, of a woman, detailed and lifelike, eyes wide, mouth open in mid-cry. The plaque below read Teresa Langdon. Gasp spread again. Teresa herself stared at the image, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. Her son gripped her arm. Claire's voice trembled, but she pushed on. I made this after reading her first letter. I didn't know her yet. But I knew the pain. I knew the shape of injustice even when no one gave it a name. Teresa approached the screen slowly. You got the scar, she whispered. I had it from an old burn. No one ever sees it. How did you? I saw it in your words, Claire replied, barely holding back tears. In your silence, too. By now, every person remaining in the ballroom was on their feet. Not leaving. Not outraged. But watching. Witnessing. Claire continued. This exhibit was rejected by 3 major galleries before the 4th took a chance. They said it was too political. Too heavy. Too dangerous. But when it opened, it sold out. Not for the money. For the attention. For the truth. Daniel brought up the last image. It was different. It was not a sculpture, but a wall, filled with signatures. Claire's installation had invited survivors, relatives, and witnesses to write their names, or names of those who could no longer speak. There were hundreds. Written in paint, charcoal, ink, and pencil. This, Claire said, is what I was told was a waste of my life. This is what I was told didn't matter. But it matters. It mattered more than any degree, any family title, any empty approval. She turned to her father. You used the Harrison name as a symbol of excellence. But I used it to hold a mirror to the people you hurt. I didn't reject the family name. I redefined it. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was sacred. The kind that belongs only to truth finally spoken aloud. Richard stared at the screen. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply stood there, finally made to face the reflection he had never asked for. Rachel stepped forward at last. She looked at Claire, something breaking behind her eyes. Then, without a word, she placed her hand on Claire's shoulder. I didn't know, Rachel said. I thought you were running away. I wasn't, Claire replied. I was running towards something you refused to see. Daniel walked up and stood beside her. The applause didn't start loudly. It was quiet. A few hands. Then more. And more. Not a celebration. Not a victory. A reckoning. And in that moment, Claire wasn't just the artist. Or the daughter. She was the historian of their collective silence. And finally, people were ready to listen. The energy inside the Harrison estate had shifted entirely. Where once the evening had been orchestrated to celebrate Richard Harrison's storied retirement, now it throbbed with something rawer: accountability. People weren't smiling for photographs anymore. They were exchanging glances layered with questions. Some were still reeling from Claire's powerful presentation. Others clustered around Teresa Langdon, speaking to her in hushed voices, offering apologies that felt decades overdue. Amid the quiet movement, a sudden ringtone broke through the atmosphere. Heads turned toward the sound, a jarring disruption, piercing the tension with an odd urgency. It came from a tall man in his late 60s standing near the far wall. His white hair was combed neatly, and his suit had a subtle pinstripe, formal, conservative, like the courtroom men who had once shared chambers with Richard. The man looked down at his phone, eyes narrowing. He stepped away from his circle of colleagues and held the device to his ear. "Hello?" he said, voice steady but firm. A pause. Then he stiffened. "What? Are you sure?" Another pause. He turned away, walking a few steps toward the window, lowering his voice, but not enough to stop the closest guests from overhearing fragments. "When did it go live? How many outlets? Who else has it?" People began to take notice. A few moved closer, subtly, pretending not to listen. Claire, who had been speaking quietly to Daniel and Rachel, turned as well, sensing the change in rhythm. It was small, one man's voice, but it cut through the room like the beginning of a warning siren. The man ended the call and remained facing the window for a long second before slowly turning back to the room. Claire didn't know his name, but she recognized him as one of her father's former judicial colleagues, Harold Whitlock, once considered a candidate for the state Supreme Court. He walked back toward the front with a strange tightness in his posture. He didn't raise his voice when he spoke, but somehow everyone heard him. A major legal media outlet just released the full Harrison files. Everything that was handed out tonight. The Langdon case. The Morris files. The judicial discrepancies. The sealed testimony. All of it. Murmurs erupted instantly. Phones came out. Screens lit up. Claire's breath hitched. "Wait, everything?" Harold nodded once, gravely. "It's already trending. Someone leaked the entire dossier. Not just summaries, scans. Screenshots. Voice recordings." Daniel frowned, stepping forward. "It wasn't me. I was still compiling the statement before we distributed the final draft. The documents were secure," the editor added, standing nearby. "Password protected, time-stamped. We haven't published anything yet. This wasn't us." Rachel looked toward the main entrance. "Someone must have shared it early." "It's everywhere now," another voice added. "I just saw it on 3 forums and a legal watchdog page. And it's being translated. Spanish, French, even Korean. This is global." Claire tried to steady her breathing. "Does it name the victims?" "Some names are redacted," said the journalist, now scrolling his screen furiously. "But others are full. Teresa's is there. Evelyn Morris. A dozen more." Teresa, who had been holding her son close, raised her head slowly. "That wasn't supposed to happen yet," she whispered. "I thought we had time." Daniel looked furious. The goal was to let survivors speak first. On their terms. But it was too late. The story had moved beyond their control. Harold cleared his throat. "There's more. The outlet claims it's only the first part. They say more files are coming. Including internal memos. Email chains between chambers. Communications with lobbying firms." At the far end of the room, Richard stirred. He had been silent for nearly an hour, seated in a high-backed chair that once symbolized authority. Now, it felt more like a relic, part of a world being dismantled in real time. He rose slowly. "I want to know who's behind the leak," he said, his voice brittle, the weight of control slipping from his grip. "I demand to know who had access to those files and violated the chain of custody." Claire met his eyes. "Why? So you can threaten them into silence again?" He didn't respond. Someone else did. A woman in her 40s, standing near the bar, stepped forward. Claire had never seen her before. She wore a simple black blouse, no jewelry, her expression calm, but her eyes were sharp. "I gave the file to the press," the woman said. Gasps rippled through the room. Richard's mouth opened. "Who are you?" "Marianne Voss," she replied. "Former court clerk. You fired me after I raised concerns about your handling of 2 dependency hearings in 2014. I saw the original files. I saw what was changed. I've been sitting on my copy ever since." Claire turned toward her, stunned. "You were one of the whistleblowers?" "I was the first," Marianne said. But no one listened. Daniel stepped forward, astonished. "Why release it now?" Marianne met Claire's eyes. "Because I watched that girl," she said, nodding toward the projection of the sculpture of Minor 14B still frozen on the screen, "and I realized that waiting any longer was another betrayal. I had to choose. Fear or truth." Claire nodded slowly. "You chose right." Teresa stepped forward too. "Thank you," she whispered. "From all of us." Rachel let out a shaky breath. "This is going to be huge." "It already is," said the journalist, holding up his phone. "Network coverage just picked it up. It's no longer just a story. It's a scandal. Congressional calls are coming." Claire turned to Daniel. "You were ready for this." "I was ready for a storm," he said. "But this is a flood." Harold stepped in again. "A full judicial review board has already issued a preliminary statement. They're launching an inquiry into all of Harrison's cases spanning at least 25 years. Retired or not, this doesn't go away." Richard said nothing. He just sat down again, a man with no courtroom left to command. And for the first time in Claire's life, he looked small. Not because someone made him small, but because the truth had finally arrived, uninvited, unrestrained, and undeniable. The room no longer belonged to Richard Harrison. It didn't even belong to the institution his name had propped up for decades. It now belonged to the people who had been voiceless under his rule, some of them present, others represented by ink, by scars, by digital files flashing across newsrooms. Yet even with all that had been said, all that had been revealed, Claire knew one thing still remained buried. Her own truth. She stood near the edge of the room, her back to the screen still lit with her artwork, her gaze focused not on the glowing headlines surfacing on phones around her, but on the man who had made her feel invisible for most of her life. Her father sat again, his cane leaning beside him, his eyes shadowed but alert. She had never seen him look older. Or smaller. He wasn't shrunken by age. He was dwarfed by the truth. Claire stepped forward, and as if pulled by gravity, the room quieted. Conversations died down. Phones lowered. Even the journalists paused. The sudden hush wasn't orchestrated, it was collective, instinctive. She turned to face everyone. Her voice was not loud, but it was resonant, clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "I've spent most of my life wondering what I did wrong," she began. "I thought maybe I didn't try hard enough. That I didn't choose the right path. That I didn't wear the name, Harrison, the way I was supposed to. That's how it always felt, like a suit tailored for someone else, but handed to me with expectations I couldn't meet." Daniel watched from the side, his hands clasped in front of him. Rachel stood behind Claire, her arms crossed but her head bowed slightly, listening closely. Matthew, nowhere in sight, had likely left in the chaos. Claire didn't care anymore. She continued. "I tried. I applied to law school, twice. I got in. But I didn't go. I told myself it was because I wanted to be free, that art gave me a voice. And that's true. But there was another reason. I didn't want to become him. She didn't point to her father, but the implication was crystal clear. Claire took a breath, then turned directly to Richard. I spent years hoping for your approval. For a word. A glance. Anything. You gave Rachel praise. You gave Matthew your legacy. You gave me silence. And the few times you did speak about me, it was through disappointment. I wasn't a judge. I wasn't a surgeon. I wasn't useful. The silence was excruciating. I remember once, she continued, voice softening, you told a colleague at a fundraiser that I had potential, but lacked direction. I was 17. I'd just gotten accepted into a fine arts academy on a full scholarship. You never mentioned it. But I heard you say that. And it stayed with me. She looked down at her hands for a moment, then lifted her gaze again. I let that sentence shape me. Not because it was true, but because it came from you. And somehow, I believed that made it important. That it meant I had failed at being your daughter. She took a step closer to him now, face to face. Her father didn't interrupt. His eyes were locked on hers. There was no rage. No pride. Just quiet recognition. But tonight, I finally understand something. I was never your failure. I was your reminder. That you couldn't control everything. That not every legacy bends to your version of success. She turned again to the crowd. I've had days where I thought I was going crazy. Where I thought maybe I really was the one who didn't belong. That if I just worked harder, maybe I'd earn my place. But the truth is, I never lost my place. It was taken from me. Denied. Because I didn't serve the image this family wanted to protect. Her voice caught. She steadied herself. I don't want revenge. I don't want to see anyone destroyed. That's not justice. But I do want acknowledgement. I want every person who sat in a courtroom and felt dismissed, every mother who was ignored, every child who went unseen, I want them to know they weren't wrong. They weren't crazy. They were victims of a system shaped by people like my father, who believed that power meant being right, even when they were not. She looked back at Richard. I forgive you. That landed harder than any accusation. There was no applause. Just stunned stillness. Claire wasn't finished. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I no longer carry the burden of your silence. It means I stopped trying to earn something you were never willing to give. I don't need to be your daughter in the way you defined it. I already know who I am. Daniel stepped forward now, joining her. She's more than your daughter, he said. She's the voice of every person you overlooked. Claire looked out at the guests one last time. You wanted this to be your night, Father. But maybe it's only fitting that your last celebration became someone else's first moment of truth. And if nothing else, I hope that truth reaches the next girl like me, the one sitting quietly, waiting to be seen. She stepped back. No one said a word. No one needed to. The silence was her punctuation. And it rang louder than any gavel her father had ever dropped. By the time Claire stepped away from the center of the room, the atmosphere had become something no one present would ever forget. The gravity of her words lingered like smoke, dense and undeniable. The murmurs that followed were hushed, reverent. Some guests avoided eye contact altogether. Others wiped at the corners of their eyes, pretending dust had found its way inside. It wasn't just about Claire's personal reckoning anymore. It was about what had been uncovered, what had been hidden, and who had helped hide it. Richard remained seated, still and silent, but his eyes tracked every motion around him. The legal titans who had once stood at his side now lingered near the walls or back toward the exits. One by one, they were slipping away, not with outrage, but with the uncomfortable quiet of self-preservation. These were men and women who had built careers under the umbrella of his influence. Now, that umbrella had been turned inside out. Near the grand staircase, the investigative journalist stepped into the light, his phone in hand, face lit by the screen. "It's official," he said, addressing the room without raising his voice. "The Judicial Accountability Board has issued an emergency review. All of Harrison's family court decisions from the last 25 years are being flagged for investigation, including sealed rulings." A second later, another notification echoed from a nearby phone. Then another. Then dozens more. Claire turned her head as the journalist continued, now reading from a press release. "Effective immediately, Judge Richard Harrison is to relinquish access to all private judicial records under his name. The court will appoint independent auditors to begin re-examining case outcomes where ethical discrepancies have been cited." Richard's jaw clenched slightly. For a moment, it seemed as though he might stand and challenge the verdict, not from the board, but from the room itself. Yet he didn't. His shoulders sagged imperceptibly. Daniel crossed the space toward one of the few remaining guests, a middle-aged woman in a tan suit who had been a longtime legal associate of Richard's. "Are you staying to support him?" he asked directly. She didn't hesitate. "No," she said. "I stayed to witness this. For the people whose stories never made it out of those courtrooms." She turned to Claire, her eyes heavy with a kind of restrained sorrow. "I'm sorry. For not speaking sooner." Claire nodded once. "Then speak now. To the press. To the board. Help undo the damage." The woman's eyes lingered on her before she gave a short, definitive nod. "I will." Rachel moved closer to her father. Her voice, though barely above a whisper, carried. "You could say something. Anything." Richard exhaled through his nose. "I said enough tonight." Claire shook her head. "You said the wrong things. And too late." Rachel knelt beside his chair. "Dad, this doesn't end here. They're not just going after the rulings, they're going after everything. Financial records. Donations. Travel logs. This could turn into a federal probe." He looked at her. "I know." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "And you're just going to let them come?" Richard straightened, his spine stiffened by pride even now. "There's nothing left to protect." Rachel slowly stood and backed away. Her silence was more damning than any words she might have offered. Harold Whitlock, one of the last judges in the room who had worked closely with Richard, finally stepped into the open. "I never thought I'd live to see the day," he said, looking around. "Your decisions shaped decades of legal precedent, Richard. But now it's clear, many of them were built on convenience, not constitutionality." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "Do you think I was the only one?" Harold didn't blink. "No. But you were the loudest." The final shift came when the main doors opened and the local news cameras entered. It hadn't been part of the original plan. Claire watched as reporters, cameramen, and producers filed in quietly, setting up their equipment at the far end of the room. The public portion of the story had arrived, and no one could stop it. A young anchor approached Richard. "Judge Harrison, would you like to make a statement?" His lips parted. For the first time, he looked directly at the lens of the camera. Not with the power he once wielded. Not with authority. But with the pale reflection of a man who could no longer hide behind robes and marble walls. His voice was even. But not strong. "I served for nearly 4 decades. I made thousands of rulings. I believed I was firm but fair." A pause. "But I see now that in some cases, maybe more than some, I prioritized the system over the individual. That was a mistake. One I will answer for." The anchor tilted her head slightly. "Is this a resignation?" Richard hesitated. Claire stepped forward, standing beside the camera now. "It already was," she said, loud enough for all to hear. That was the moment that defined the night. Not the leak. Not the projections or the files. But the visual of Richard Harrison sitting in silence while his daughter, once dismissed and disregarded, declared the final verdict. The anchor turned to Claire. "Would you care to comment, Ms. Harrison?" She looked at Daniel, then at Rachel, then back at the camera. "Yes," she said. "Let the record show that no truth can stay buried forever. Not when people are willing to speak. Not when silence becomes too loud to bear." The anchor nodded. "And what now?" Claire inhaled. "Now, we rebuild. But not around men like him. Around the people he left behind." As the cameras kept rolling, and as Richard slowly looked away, down toward the floor where his shadow no longer stretched as far as it used to, Claire walked off screen. The applause that followed was not for spectacle. It was for a story no longer hidden. And for a woman who refused to be silent any longer. The ballroom had been all but emptied. The cameras were gone, the guests dispersed, and even the press had moved their vans to the edge of the estate, broadcasting live under the glow of parking lot lights. The estate no longer radiated celebration, it pulsed with the aftershock of truth. Only a handful of people remained inside: Claire, Daniel, Rachel, Teresa, and a few of the most resolute witnesses. Richard had retreated to his study, flanked by silence and shadow. No one followed him. Claire sat on a velvet bench beneath the grand staircase, her posture not tense, but drained. Her voice, her strength, her endurance had all been tested tonight. What remained was something new: clarity. Not peace. That would take time. But clarity, at least, had finally arrived. Daniel approached her quietly. His steps were light, respectful, but she sensed him even before she saw him. When he sat beside her, she leaned slightly toward him, as if their weight needed to be shared. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he held out a worn folder. She looked at it. It was plain, brown, and slightly frayed at the corners. The kind of folder a lawyer would overlook for its lack of glamour. But Claire immediately sensed what it was. "What's that?" she asked, already knowing. Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice quiet. "The rest of the story." She turned to him. "What do you mean?" "I didn't just collect the Harrison files because I wanted to help," he said. "I did it because I owed someone." Claire tilted her head. "Owed who?" He looked down at the folder. "My sister." Claire froze. "She was one of them," Daniel continued. "One of the names on those sealed case files. She was 15 when it happened. My family never talks about it. Said it was too painful. Said it was complicated. I only found out after we got married, when I started researching your father." Claire's voice came out low, disbelieving. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want this to be about revenge," he said quickly. "It was never about that. I needed to make sure I wasn't blinded by it. That I wasn't just trying to settle a score." He opened the folder, revealing a photocopy of a custody appeal. The name was there: Jennifer Harper. A girl Claire had never met, not even seen in photos. The court record had been partially redacted, but Claire could see the pieces. A ruling that had separated her from a protective aunt. A foster system that placed her in temporary care. A pattern that matched others. The judge's name at the bottom: Richard Harrison. Claire stared at the signature. "Your sister." "She's gone," Daniel said, the words sticking in his throat. "She died 3 years later. Complications from an untreated condition she developed in foster care. She might have lived if someone had listened to the aunt who fought for her. But that never happened." Claire placed her hand on the file. "You kept this from me for years." "I did," Daniel admitted. "Because I didn't want your pain to be clouded by mine. I didn't want to manipulate you into fighting battles you didn't choose." She looked at him, stunned not by the secrecy, but by the discipline it must have taken to carry that burden while standing beside her, silently building a case that would dismantle the man who ruined them both. "You gave me strength," Claire said, "but I never knew how much it cost you." Daniel gave a bitter smile. "It didn't matter what it cost, Claire. What mattered was that someone finally told the truth. Not just for you. Or for Teresa. Or for the others. But for Jennifer. She never got a voice. Claire pulled the folder into her lap. Now she does. Daniel nodded. That's why I stood up tonight. Why I couldn't stay seated while you were told to leave. Because he didn't just dismiss you. He dismissed her. Again. Claire's hands trembled slightly. The weight of everything, the revelations, the injustice, the connections, was almost too much to carry. And yet, this was the final puzzle piece. It made sense now. Why Daniel had never needed convincing. Why he always encouraged her to fight. Why he knew exactly where to look. You've been her advocate this whole time, Claire said softly. I failed her once, Daniel whispered. I wasn't old enough to stop it. I didn't even know how bad it was until it was over. But I swore I wouldn't fail again. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. You didn't. Rachel, who had been quietly watching from a distance, stepped closer. Her eyes flicked between them, sensing something important had shifted but not yet knowing what. She said nothing, just waited. Claire looked up and finally broke the silence. Jennifer Harper. Daniel's sister. One of Dad's cases. Rachel blinked. What? Another sealed file, Daniel explained. She was a child when he ruled. A victim of the same pattern. She's not here to speak for herself. But we are. Rachel's mouth opened, then closed again. She looked away, overwhelmed. I'll give the folder to the board, Daniel said. It needs to be on record. Claire nodded. But the story needs to be told by us. Daniel turned toward her. You mean, publicly? Claire's eyes sharpened. Yes. It's time people stop being statistics. Your sister was more than a case file. She was a person. And if I can give her even one paragraph in the narrative, I will. Rachel finally spoke. Claire, you realize what you're doing, right? You're about to become the face of this. I already am, Claire replied. And I'll carry that. Because if I don't, someone else will carry silence instead. Teresa stepped in from the side, holding her son's hand. Jennifer matters, she said gently. Just like my son matters. Just like Evelyn Morris's daughter does. The more names we say out loud, the less power silence has. Claire stood. She held the folder high, not for spectacle, but for ceremony. This isn't about destroying a man, she said. It's about freeing the people he tried to erase. Every name is a life. Every sealed file is a locked door. And I plan to open every single one. The others nodded. Rachel stepped beside her. Daniel took her hand. And somewhere, deep within the memory of the girl Daniel had loved and lost, a light flickered back on. The world had tried to forget Jennifer Harper. But her name had finally been spoken. Morning crept into the estate like a quiet reckoning. The once vibrant chandeliers had gone dim, the polished silverware removed from the long tables, and the lingering scent of perfumed guests replaced by the cold, neutral aroma of empty space. It was as if the house itself understood something irreversible had happened. Claire stood at the top of the grand staircase, gazing down at what remained of her father's final celebration. A single champagne glass had been left on the ledge, forgotten. The banners with his name were gone. Even the floral centerpieces had been stripped from the tables, as if the night had never meant to be remembered in the way it was originally planned. She clutched her coat and slowly descended the stairs. Daniel waited for her near the entrance, his arm gently resting on the doorframe. Rachel stood near the far wall, speaking in hushed tones to a journalist still taking follow-up notes. Teresa had already gone home with her son, but not before promising Claire she would appear at the first public hearing, ready to testify, not for revenge, but for recognition. Matthew had never returned. Claire's heels echoed softly as she crossed the now quiet ballroom and stood in front of the door. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Richard's voice broke the silence. Claire. It was the first time he had said her name in hours. Perhaps days. She turned, slowly. He stood by the base of the staircase, leaning on his cane. He looked older than ever. Not just because of his body. His voice carried the weight of finality, like a man whose last sentence had already been spoken but who still wanted to hear the sound of his own words one last time. Claire didn't move toward him. She didn't invite more. I built everything I had on rules, he said. On structure. On what I thought justice meant. I didn't know how to love outside of that. Claire's eyes didn't soften. They didn't harden either. She waited, calm, collected. I told myself that if I stayed objective, if I held everyone to the same standard, then I was being fair, he continued. But I was wrong. Justice without compassion becomes cruelty. Still, she said nothing. I wanted to protect the name, Richard said, his voice wavering. But maybe, it was never worth protecting the way I thought. Claire finally stepped forward. You wanted to protect the Harrison name because you saw it as a symbol of power. But what you never understood is that power without accountability is just control. And control without love isn't family. He stared at her, not in anger, but in slow understanding. Daniel moved beside her. Richard looked at him. You stood up for her. I never did. I see that now. Daniel didn't respond. Claire took Daniel's hand and turned to leave. But Richard's voice came again. I never said goodbye to you. Not properly. Claire stopped, but she didn't turn around. You did, she said. When you asked me to leave. She reached for the door handle. I was wrong, Richard said. You weren't just wrong, she replied, turning to face him once more. You were cruel. You used silence as a weapon. You measured love by achievement. You watched me struggle and offered no comfort. And when I needed you to believe in me, you judged me instead. So, no, you don't get a new goodbye. You get the one you earned. She opened the door. But before stepping out, she looked back a final time. I used to think the worst part of my life was not being seen. But the truth is, I saw everything. I just stopped waiting for you to see it too. Rachel slowly walked up behind her, her expression unreadable. She looked at their father, then at Claire. I'm sorry, Rachel said. For letting you carry this alone. Claire gave her a small nod. Then don't let the next person carry it. Rachel stepped closer to Richard, but Claire and Daniel walked out together, into the brisk morning light. The sky was a pale gold, the kind that comes only after a long, painful storm. The driveway was nearly empty now, save for a single parked car waiting to take them away. As they approached it, Claire stopped beside the family crest engraved near the front gate. The bold lettering of Harrison Estate stood in stone, proud and unyielding. Claire reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded card. It was the final gallery invitation she had received, this time, for an international exhibition in Berlin. She had been asked to bring her newest collection. But for the first time, the invitation didn't refer to her as Claire Harrison. Instead, it bore the name Claire Langdon. The name of the woman who had once lost her son in silence. The name of the woman whose story had started it all. She looked at the card for a moment, then tucked it back into her coat. Daniel watched her. Are you sure? Yes, she said. That name means something. Not because of blood. But because of truth. They stepped into the car. As it pulled away from the estate, Claire didn't look back. She was no longer running from her family. She was walking into her future, finally under a name she chose. And this time, she wouldn't be erased. Several weeks had passed since the night that unraveled decades of silence and reputation. The Harrison estate, once the epicenter of power and propriety, had receded into the shadows of scandal, now occupied by lawyers, investigators, and reporters instead of judges, colleagues, or admirers. The name Richard Harrison had shifted from a respected legacy to a cautionary tale, and with it, the world around Claire had transformed too. In a loft apartment in Brooklyn, Claire stood in front of a floor-length mirror, carefully pinning her hair up. The space around her was sparse but filled with warmth, canvases leaning against the walls, sculptures mid-construction, journals open beside mugs of tea. Everything in the room bore the signature of a life created, not inherited. Daniel entered, holding a thick envelope he had just retrieved from the downstairs mailbox. "It's here," he said, his voice filled with a mix of pride and quiet reverence. Claire turned, wiping her clay-streaked hands on a towel. She reached for the envelope with slow fingers. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. She had been waiting for this moment, and yet, she had stopped holding her breath. She had finally learned that the future came not with a crash, but in the quiet aftermath of truth. She unfolded the crisp invitation. The letterhead was unmistakably formal, gold-embossed lettering, a Berlin address, and an invitation to one of the most prestigious international contemporary art exhibitions in Europe. But that wasn't what made Claire's breath hitch. What did was the name at the top. Claire Langdon. She traced the letters with her fingers, barely believing it had finally happened. Her new name wasn't just symbolic. It was legal now. Public. Published. Chosen. Langdon. The name of the woman who had written a letter in ink so determined it had bled through the paper. The woman whose voice had been dismissed in court but whose story had sparked a movement. The name that had become a mirror Claire held up not just to her father's legacy, but to her own. Daniel sat beside her on the edge of the couch. "How does it feel?" he asked. Claire stared at the card for a long moment. "Like I'm finally visible," she said. There had been consequences, of course. Headlines that burned through news cycles. Online panels debating legal ethics. Former clerks and colleagues issuing statements, some apologies, some defenses. But the truth was too loud now to be drowned by spin. Her father had issued a second public statement, stiff, vaguely regretful, and entirely too late. The Judicial Review Board was still unraveling his rulings. Several were already overturned. Others had reopened old wounds, forcing families back into courtrooms they had long tried to forget. Claire had been contacted by 3 national news outlets and offered interviews by every major podcast in the legal and artistic spaces. She turned down most. But she agreed to one, the same journalist who had stood in that ballroom and read the first statement aloud. In that interview, she didn't speak about her father at length. She spoke about Jennifer Harper. About Evelyn Morris. About Teresa Langdon. About the children lost in bureaucratic silence. And she spoke about art, how each sculpture she made now carried the fingerprints of the people no one else had touched. Claire looked back at Daniel. "Do you think Jennifer would have come tonight?" she asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was full of something both sad and steady. "She would have stood in the front row. And she would have smiled, knowing you carried her story the way no one else could." Claire turned the invitation over. On the back was the title of the featured piece, Restored Silence. It was her newest sculpture, an installation of broken court benches, each one carved with names. The wood cracked, split, yet reassembled with molten iron seams running through them like veins. It was imperfect. And it was beautiful. She had built it not just as a statement of what was broken, but of what could be rebuilt. Rachel had sent a message earlier that morning. A simple one: "I want to come to the exhibition. I want to see what I didn't see before." Claire had replied, "You're welcome to. But come as someone willing to learn, not to lead." Matthew had remained silent. Claire didn't expect more. At the gallery in Berlin, the crowd gathered slowly, then all at once. Artists, journalists, survivors, and strangers filtered through the doors of the converted warehouse space that now held her work. Each piece was positioned carefully under low, golden light, inviting intimacy, not spectacle. Claire stood near the entrance, wearing a black jacket embroidered with small, gold stitches in the shape of broken chains. She wore no name tag. But people knew who she was. One woman approached her. Her eyes were tired but warm. She pointed to the sculpture titled Letter without reply. Was this Teresa's? Claire nodded. It was everyone's. Another man, perhaps in his 60s, stopped beside her at witness 14B, his voice trembling. My sister lost her children to a judge like yours. Thank you for saying what no one else would. A child ran past, stopping in front of the sculpture titled Bound Verdicts. He stared for a long time before whispering, "It looks like it's trying to breathe." Claire knelt beside him. That's because it is. By the time the gallery lights dimmed for the night, the walls were covered with small white cards, notes left by visitors. Some signed with initials. Some anonymous. All of them saying the same thing in different ways: "Thank you for giving my silence shape." Daniel approached with 2 glasses of water. Claire took hers, sipped, then looked out at the room. "This isn't the end," she said. Daniel smiled. "No. It's the start of the truth's second life." She turned back to the entrance, where the plaque read, "Claire Langdon, Sculptures from the Silence." She had signed it that way intentionally. She had walked away from the Harrison name, not with bitterness, but with purpose. And as the last guest stepped through the gallery, pausing to look back at her one final time, Claire knew she had done the impossible. She had taken the name of a forgotten woman and made it unforgettable. She had rewritten her legacy. And this time, every part of it belonged to her.